good afternoon, everyone. I'm Martin Smith from GAD. I think we're probably ready to move on to the second slide.
Yeah, so we're going to do this as a double act. So I think we haven't practiced this, but hopefully we'll know who wants to speak when. So on to the next slide. So obviously you're all familiar with the Scheme Advisory Board in Scotland. Just in case you're not as familiar with the Scheme Advisory Board in England and Wales, we were established back in 2014 and currently chaired by Councillor Roger Phillips, who's been the chair since 2016. The secretariat for the Scheme Advisory Board is provided by the LGA, so that's the link between SAB and LGA in England and Wales. And similar to your purpose, the SAB's purpose is to provide advice to the Secretary of State, but also to administering authorities on desirability of changes to the scheme and in relation to the effective and efficient administration and management of the LGPS. We have a website, which the clickable link is there for you, and we do update that relatively regularly with lots of news items. So it's worth bookmarking if you don't already have access to that. I'll hand over to Martin.
Thanks, Joe. I think I've met some, or at least or most, through previous LGPS Scotland SAB meetings, but for anyone who I haven't met, I guess a sort of a very brief introduction in respect of GAD. We are a non-ministerial government department. Our mission is fundamentally to support that the government's finances are well run and are transparent. And in doing that, we support various departments across England and Wales, and also Scotland and Northern Ireland. We're involved in a number of different aspects of work across government, but supporting on the public service pension schemes remains a sort of core element to that work. And colleagues of mine have supported Jo and her team in England and Wales SAB on their initial investigations into the gender pension gap analysis for LGPS England and Wales.
Thank you. So next slide gives a bit of background information. I think you were going to cover this, Martin.
Yeah, so I think we noted that the data analysis that's being carried out has been carried out for LGPS England and Wales, but to help contextualise this, we thought it might be useful to have a brief sort of bird's eye view on both the England and Wales and the Scotland arrangement, sort of side by side. And I think comparing them, you can see that the scales are quite different, but the broad structure that members accrue benefits under are quite similar. Except for some dates when benefit reforms were implemented, and I guess those main reforms, which we're all of course familiar with, are primarily the move from the final salary linked benefit structure to the career average revalued care scheme benefit structure. So in most cases, if you were to consider two identical members, one in England and Wales and one in Scotland, you'd expect sort of broadly similar levels of benefits to be payable from both schemes at retirement. But there are various differences in the underlying benefit regulations. There's also some small differences in the membership profile and the experience for both memberships. So I think when we consider the output from the England and Wales analysis, we need to consider it in that sort of context only. And I think at this point we're going to turn to have a look at the SAB's initial investigations on the gender pension gap in England and Wales.
Yep. So what happened? Well, we decided as a Scheme Advisory Board in England and Wales that we wanted to do some more research into this. And so we commissioned GAD to give us a report. The commission's there. We wanted an overview of how pension income and total pension pot size in the LGPS were impacted by gender. The information that GAD used to produce the report included the data they get from the administrators, which is shared for the purposes of the scheme valuation, which is the quadrennial scheme valuation, not the triennial fund valuation. and that included gender, pay and service information. And that's obviously the information that comes to administering authorities from employers. There's no other information about any other protected characteristics. That's something, that's a whole other issue to go into about other protected characteristics and how that affects pension. The LGPS benefits were analysed by GAD using national insurance numbers so that it was clear where it was individual data. And this is purely just LGPS data, so just their service in the LGPS. It doesn't include anything around state pensions, private pensions or other savings. And some of that, obviously, Alexandra gave us a broader overview of some of that in her presentation. So what did it show? So we split this out into active members and then pensioner members. And so you will see there the actual pay gap that GAD found was 31.7% between men and women. There was a care pension gap, so that's the savings built up more recently. So since the scheme changed in 2014 in England and Wales, and that's at 34.7%. And the final salary pension gap is 46.4%. And that obviously the final salary is pre-2014 service that was built up to that point. And the key point there, which I'm sure is the same in LGPS Scotland, is that women comprise around 74% of the membership within the LGPS in England and Wales. So a huge proportion of our membership. But they have lower mean pay and lower accrued pension as a result of that. Over to you, Martin.
Thanks, Jo. So as Jo explained there, the underlying data we used was that from the quadrennial valuation carried out April 2020. So this is a snapshot somewhat, but we do tend to find that sort of information relating to gaps tends to move quite slowly in time. So this is probably a decent representation of the existing gap as much as it was the gap reported in 2020. And I just wanted to highlight a few interesting points, I guess, emerging from the charts. So first of all, looking at the two pay charts, so the mean actual pay and the mean full-time equivalent pay. So you'll see that in terms of there being a pay gap, that doesn't actually emerge in the data at the outset in sort of early 20s. That only begins to emerge once members are into their 30s, and it's at that point that you then see, by looking at the care pension graph and the legacy or the final salary pension graph, that gap in pay then filters into a gap under both the care and the legacy pension. And a detail that's perhaps not immediately obvious, and you need to consider the scale of both the care pension and the legacy pension chart, is actually the gap is steeper under the legacy pension than it is under the care pension, and that's reflected in the gaps that Jo observed in the top left hand side. That there's effectively a larger gap coming through from the final salary pension than from the care pension. And sort of tracking the pay charts a bit later in life, you can see that the gap in pay tends to narrow at later ages, so into the sort of late 50s. You can observe that pay gap narrowing, which then also filters into a narrowing of the pension gap at those ages as well. And whilst we haven't carried out any sort of specific analysis on the LGPS Scotland scheme, there is some information available from the 2020 valuation data report, and that's set out at the bottom left-hand side of the slide. You'll see there that there's a difference in the male average pay to the female average pay of around £8,000. That, in terms of a gap, is of an order of 30%. So broadly consistent with the actual pay gap observed in the England and Wales scheme.
Thanks, Martin. So next slide, yeah. So this is the headline findings for pensioner members. So it is different. Pensions in payment gap for pensioner members is 49.4%. So really, really significant number. And although women are a lower proportion of pensioners currently in the LGPS England and Wales at around 62%, again, significantly lower pensions than men. And over to you, Martin, for more detail.
Thanks. So what the chart shows is actually the distribution of LGPS pensions and payment sizes by gender. And what we can see is by looking at the left-hand side of that chart is that there's a much greater proportion of females that have an LGPS pension under £5,000 relative to males, and that £5,000, that's not the pot value, that's the annual pension income from the LGPS. Again, we haven't carried out the exact same analysis for LGPS Scotland, but we do have that information available from the 2020 valuation data reports, which is set out at the bottom right-hand side of the screen. And we can see a gap between the average male and female pension and payment of around £3,500. That equates to a gap of around about 45%. So again, quite consistent with the gap that we've measured within the England and Wales LGPS arrangement. And I think with the information in terms of active members and also pensioner members, it was this output that led to the SAB considering obtaining additional analysis in respect of the gender pensions gap, which I think Joe's going to take us through now.
Yep. So, so what we've gone through already was the initial report that GAD did for us, and we found the information very interesting, obviously, but it was relatively high level. And so we discussed the what we'd been presented with by GAD with our one of our committees and then with the board, and we agreed that we would ask GAD to produce a further report with exploring some of this in more detail, so we could really understand, just a bit more detail about how other factors were influencing the gaps. So we asked about career patterns. So what evidence you could see that related to recent and past part-time working, and also we asked them to look at employer categories as well. So whether there was anything that was emerging from the different kinds of employers that we see across the LGPS, which the numbers depends on which evidence you look at. Which data you look at rather. There's anywhere between 15,000 and 20,000 employers in the LGPS in England and Wales, so an awful lot of employers to consider and look at. Obviously they're split into some significant sectors, but we thought it was interesting to look at that by category as well. And one thing to say, we are the sector leader here amongst public service pension schemes in the UK. We're the only one so far that's done this level of detailed analysis, and we have been encouraging HM Treasury officials as well as ministers to do this across the public sector. We think this would be really valuable exercise to do more broadly across public sector pensions, and we are hopeful that that will come in time, but we haven't seen that just yet. So on to the next slide. So this is the data around part-time working patterns, and I'll ask Martin to give you a bit of an idea of what the chart is showing. But effectively, men and women who have always worked full-time have a very different picture. There's still a gap, which reflects the pay gap, but it's much narrower. And obviously, where you see, the majority of women do spend some of their career working part-time, so that's generally where you see the gap start to widen and appear. Martin, any more detail?
Yeah, thanks, Joe. So as Joe's described, what this chart illustrates is effectively the gender pension gap when both current and historic part-time working patterns have been controlled, i.e. the effect on pension of working part-time has been broadly stripped out within the information in this chart. And what that you'll see shows is that there's a much closer grouping of pension between sexes observed, certainly initially up until around the age of 40. You'll see that those lines are tracking quite close to each other. But we do still then have a slightly widening of that gap emerging from roughly age 40, and that gap increases up until around late 50s before narrowing again into mid 60s. So I think what this sort of clearly indicates is that an LGPS gender pension gap attributable to working pattern doesn't contribute significantly to that gap up until the age of around 40.
Thanks, Martin. And so a little bit then about employers. So these two charts show you the differences between different kinds of employers and also within the same employer as well. So it's interesting that the within employer gap makes a larger contribution than the between employer effect. And as I said, there's obviously many thousands of employers in the LGPS, but by broad category, you're looking at councils, schools, those kind of service providers. I think it is quite difficult to apportion types of employers due to the way the data is held, and it would require a lot more GAD analysis to really delve into some of this a bit more. And we haven't gone ahead with that sort of next stage of analysis at this point in time. That was partly due to budgetary constraints, but also we wanted to see sort of what the impact of this research was before we decided whether to go a bit further. I'm just hoping that government picks up this baton and we can hand that over in some ways. So anything you want to say on that chart, those charts, Martin, to explain it a bit more?
Yeah, so within the data that we get from evaluations, we do get sort of limited information in respect of employers and are able to identify if individuals work for the same employer, for example, and we get sort of codes in terms of what sort of category you might be able to record an employer as, or within a certain area. So using that, we were able to calculate full-time equivalent pay for each unique employer code that we were given in the data, and that, as you mentioned, enabled us to determine sort of between employer or within employer effects, i.e. to what extent is the pay gap derived from females working for lower paying employers, the between employer effect, or females working for the same employer but being paid less than males within that employer, and that's referred to as the with employer effect. And what the charts shows, if you look at the left hand side one, at one, in fact, both of them to begin with, that there is a gap relating to both between employer and within employer effects. As Joe mentioned, the larger gap is attributable to the within employer effects. So that's the females working for the same employer but being paid less than males. And there is some sort of additional detail within the graphs, which I think is sort of quite interesting. And one of those is that the pay gap under the age of 30 looks to mainly be due to between employer effects. So that means that there's sort of females only start earning less than their male counterparts around the age of 30. And that age might correlate to when, on average, females might start to have their first childcare responsibilities. Whereas if you look at the left-hand side chart, you'll see that the between employer effect that has already appeared in the early 20s. so possibly less related to childcare responsibilities. So females working for lower paying employers may tend to contribute to the pay gap at earlier ages. And there was also some analysis carried out in terms of average pay for employers with higher percentages of females in them and vice versa. And I think Joe was going to cover that in the next slide.
Yep. So I personally quite like this one. This came from the June 2023 report, so it's chart 13 in that report. And you can find all these reports on the SAB website at the link I shared earlier. So this is where the analysis looked at identifying different categories of employers. And you can see there's an awful lot of different types of employers there. As I said earlier, there's many different types. And where those employers correlate to the male and female workforce split. So yeah, I think that's personally quite an interesting, slightly different chart to the other ones. I know it's quite small fonts, so it's not that easy to see, but worth having a look at in the full report if you have time. So some more comparisons, assuming there wasn't anything you wanted to say on the previous slide, Martin. Move on to this one.
Happy to move on this one, yeah. So it's probably an obvious point to make, and I think Alexander's really helpful presentation earlier hopefully supports this, that the gender pension gap is not an LGPS specific issue. We thought it'd be helpful to consider the LGPS context relative to other public and private sector arrangements. And to that effect, at the top right-hand side of this slide, sets out some historic public sector pension scheme analysis. With the LGPS at the bottom, you'll see that the results, or the gender pension gap results of that are broadly consistent with that as observed in the civil service pension scheme. The gender pension gap in the NHS pension scheme, you'll see that's quite materially higher than that of the LGPS. It's 63% compared to a figure of less than 50% for LGPS. And this might be in part due to a higher percentage of females occupying lower paid roles within the health sector. On the other side of the coin, we've got the teachers' pension scheme there. That gender pension gap is significantly smaller than LGPS. That's actually less than 30%. And that's likely due to there being less gender differences impacting on occupying of differently paid roles within the education sector. And looking at the other gaps measured using data outside of the public sector, that's set out at the lower right-hand side of the slide. You'll see that the LGPS pension gap is broadly comparable to all members with exclusively DB private pensions wealth, and that's the 44% at the bottom of the table. The LGPS gap looks to be slightly larger than when comparing against all pension savers in general, and that perhaps reinforces the view observed earlier that possibly the historic sort of final salary nature of benefits possibly contribute to a larger pension gap. And I guess it's possible that continued private sector sort of shift away from defined benefit towards defined contribution and other types of pension accrual might slowly result in more equal pension outcomes being observed between males and females more generally. And I think the place at this point, the SAB have digested the contents of these reports and are taking forward further steps in understanding the issue and doing what they can to address that from an LGPS perspective. And I think that's what Joe was going to take us through next.
Yeah, thanks, Martin. So what can we do? What are the next steps that we're undertaking and have been undertaking since we got the reports last year? Obviously, a lot of this is societal, so we can't solve it. What we are trying to look at is what can we do, where can we influence, and how can we get to the best possible point. So we established a working group last year, which actually met just before this meeting, looking at whether there are any in-scheme changes. So are there any changes to the scheme regulations that we can recommend to MHCLG, to the government? We saw things around buying back pension after an absence, which isn't consistent across all public sector schemes and is done differently, for example, in the NHS scheme to the LGPS. And whether there's any issue about multiple small pension pots and whether you can do anything to bring those together in a more automatic way, perhaps, that could help. Communications, something Alexandra talked about as well. How do you communicate with members? Really ensuring they understand the potential pension implications of career choices. Obviously, a real focus for women and men, obviously, and Alexandra talked about this around shared parental leave. Most people focus on their pay. What pay am I going to continue to receive whilst I'm on a career break? But very rarely do people think about the pension impact of taking that break. Obviously, they don't see that immediately, but they do see that later in life, and it is or can be material. So it's helping employers understand how they can support their staff. You know, Alexandra talked about the Pensions Equity Group and a report that they've issued around best practice for employers. So we're looking at that and how we might be able to shape that for the LGPS. Just trying to direct employers to what resources are available, what kind of conversations they should be having, how they might change their policies to reflect pensions as well as pay at these points in people's lives. And we're also looking at exploring standard definitions and how gaps are reported, because the more you can standardize these things, generally that helps understanding and it helps for comparison purposes as well. A couple of things that we have done already. We've done a survey of local government employers. Obviously, through the LGA in England and Wales, we have access to contact details for all of our member councils. So there's over 300 member councils of the LGA in England and Wales. And so we can contact them directly, which has been helpful. We also have academy representatives on a couple of our committees. So we're going to be using their contacts as well to get surveys directly out to academy employers. And that covers off a large proportion of the employer base in the LGPS. And we do need to speak to employers directly here because obviously the pension scheme holds, or the pension fund holds the data, holds the information that the employer passes to them. But it doesn't hold information about people, for example, who never join, so that those people who never opt in. And it's the employers that have those conversations with the member of staff around career breaks and around career choices. So that's why it's important for us to work as closely as we can with employers. And so that's what we're exploring. And it's a lot of work, but it's really interesting, and we are seeing the new government, or newish government now, taking an interest in this, and we do think that there might be something coming in the second phase of the pensions review, phase one having recently completed. We do think there might be something on this, so look out for that as well. So we just finish with disclaimers for both of us. We have to do that every time.